Internal Revenue Service IRS Tax News. Taxpayers with a filing requirement must file a tax return to get an economic impact payment. COVID Tax Tip 2020-45, April 23, 2020. While most eligible taxpayers don't need to take any action to receive an economic impact payment, some people will. This includes those who are required to file and haven't filed a tax return for either 2018 or 2019. So the general rule here being that most people are okay if you have filed for 2018 or 2019. In other words, they pushed out the deadline for 2019. So there may be a lot of people that haven't filed 2019, but you should still, in general, be okay for 2018. Now, the IRS has issued a lot of tools and talked about a lot of tools for special circumstances for people that are not required to file a tax return for one reason or another, and tried to put together tools to solve any kind of problems where they don't have the information. And I'm betting that they got a lot of questions about these tools as to whether, what if I didn't file 2018 and 2019, but I'm required to file it? In other words, you just didn't do it. We just didn't file. Then the IRS, for that circumstance, that's not what most of the tools they put together are there for. The tools are typically there to help people that are not required to file for one reason or the other and need to give the information. So if neither 2018 or 2019 were filed, they don't have 2018 or 2019, which are the basis on which they make the economic impact payment and send the economic impact payment out in general, and you're required to file, meaning your income is over the level that you would basically probably be owing taxes, is kind of like the general rule of when you would be required to file. Then the IRS is going to want the filing in order to get the economic impact payment. If you're not required to file, then you fall into one of these kind of special circumstances, and that's where all these kind of tools come into place to get the information over to the IRS, even though they don't need the income information. Because obviously what they need when they file the tax return, usually they're looking for your income information to see whether or not you've paid your taxes and then charge you the taxes on it. But if you don't owe taxes, that's when people wouldn't need to file, because normally the IRS isn't charging taxes, and that's the purpose of the tax return. So in the case when you're not filing taxes and you don't have to file taxes, then the IRS just needs your information. They don't need your income information. They just need enough information to do the economic impact payment. But if you actually owe taxes, then they need more information. They need the actual tax return, because the economic impact payment actually has a phase out of income. So if you make over a certain amount of income, then it phases out. Obviously, if you're not required to file the tax return, because the assumption is you're not required to file because your taxable income is low, and therefore you're not going to hit that AGI or income limitation to get the economic impact payment. If you are required to file a tax return, they need the tax return because they need to know what your income is, and then be able to apply out the income limitation for the calculation. Back to the text. Here are some facts for eligible taxpayers who need to and haven't filed a tax return for 2018 or 2019. Eligible taxpayers with a filing requirement who haven't filed a tax return for 2018 or 2019 must file for 2019 to get an economic impact payment. So note, the general rule here is like, okay, if you didn't file 2019 as of now, then that's okay, because we'll base it on your 2018 tax return. So unless something in 2018 had changed from 2018 to 2019, you should be okay, because they can use the 2018 to process the economic impact payment. But if you were required to file 2018 and 2019 and you haven't, then they want a filing of a tax return. And at that point, you might say, well, why don't I just file 2018? That's the last tax return. But they're saying if you fall into that circumstance, they want the 2019 tax return. So if you haven't filed either 2018 or 2019 and are required to do so due to the fact that your income is over the normal filing requirement, you can't use one of the special tools, but actually have to file. And the one they're looking for in that circumstance is the 2019 tax return. So in other words, if you haven't filed 2019 and you're required to do so, and you haven't filed 2018, then you might want to file 2019, even if you don't have everything you need to make it perfect. Meaning, if you have a business and you don't know exactly you haven't been able to put together all the bookkeeping information to make it exactly what you think it is correct, then you may want to file it still to do your best job with it and say, hey, look, this is my best estimate of what I have at this point in time. And hopefully that's good enough to then process the economic impact payment. Then when you gather all your information together, more bookkeeping and whatever information to solidify your numbers more, you can amend the tax return at that time. And that time, in that way, you'll be doing your best good faith effort to give the information as best you can right now. And that'll allow the IRS to have the information to calculate the economic impact payment, give you the economic impact payment if it applies. In other words, if you haven't gone over the AGI income limitation in order for it to phase out, and then you can make any further adjustments to it and amend the tax return at a later time to make things, to the level of assurity that you want to have as you submit the tax return. Back to the text. Taxpayers should file electronically and include direct deposit information to get their economic impact payments faster. So remember, they're always going to be emphasizing the direct deposit information because they want to issue the checks faster right now due to stimulate the economy for one, and two, they don't have the resources to process the paper checks due to social distancing as fast as they normally would. Now, if you don't give them, if you want the payment and you file 2019 tax return because you hadn't filed 2018 or 2019, and you just give them your mailing address, then they'll mail the check most likely. They'll still be able to process the payment, but it'll take longer, and that's the whole point right now. It's probably a timing thing that you're looking for. So so if you want it faster, then the direct deposit, is typically the way to go. Back to the text. The $1,200 payment will automatically be sent to those who receive Social Security, Railroad Retirement, or Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI and SSI, and veteran benefits, but don't normally file a tax return. So this is the area that they've been emphasizing a lot, which has probably been causing confusion to people that haven't filed the tax return who are required to. In other words, they're really looking at those types of people. They want to give the payment out to people who haven't filed because they're not required to file. For example, people that aren't required to file because they get some type of benefit program from some at least partial government organization that isn't possibly taxable. Some of it may not be taxable, and therefore there's no tax on it. So they wouldn't normally have to file a tax return, which is the normal objective of the tax return being to pay taxes. If you don't owe any taxes, then you might fall into a situation where you don't need to file the tax return. The IRS is trying to say, look, we're trying to work with these other organizations to be able to get the information we need to process the refund, which usually goes through the tax filing, but these people haven't filed the taxes, and they don't need to. It's not their fault. So we're going to try to do this by just working with these organizations, getting the information we need, which doesn't include income information in this case, because the assumption is they make below the income limitation. We don't need their income information unless it's going to be high enough that it goes beyond the cap, their taxable income high enough that it's going to phase out. The assumption is if they're not filing taxes and they're not required to, it's because their taxable income is below that point. So this is where they've been spending a lot of time. This is where people are probably unaware of what to do because they haven't been filing the taxes. Now, as they concentrate on these areas, people are probably confusing that situation with a situation where people just haven't filed the tax return, which is common too, and that happens. You just haven't filed 2018 and 2019, but you have to. That's a different situation because if you haven't filed the tax return, they need the income information because they need to calculate the phase-out period. So if you just haven't filed, they don't have enough information because they need your AGI information to see if you're over the limit, to see if the amount of the economic payment is going to phase out. Whereas in these individuals, they know they're not going to hit the AGI, so they don't really need the income information in order to see if it's going to phase out. Back to the text. However, to add the $500 per eligible child amount to these payments, the IRS needs the dependent information before the payments are issued. So with these individuals that don't file, they should still be okay. They should still be okay because the IRS is working with these organizations. So if you get a payment from these organizations, the IRS is going to work with them, and basically you shouldn't need to do anything. However, if you want the payment faster because these organizations send you a paper check and you want the direct deposit because you need the money now, you might want to use a tool to give them the banking information. Or if you have an eligible child, which is something that they would not be able to know through working with these institutions to see what the payment amount is, and which could affect the amount of the economic impact payment, then you would also need to to provide more information. So general rule, don't need to do anything if you're not required to file the tax return. However, you get payments from one of these institutions because they can get that information here. But if you are required to file the tax return and just haven't, then typically you need to file the tax return. If you fall into one of these groups that you get payments, you're not required to file, you will get a payment, but it will only be for the $1,200. If you have a qualifying child, then you're going to have to give them that information. You're going to have to use one of these special tools to do so. Back to the text. Otherwise, their payment at this time will be $1,200, and by law, the additional $500 per eligible child amount would be paid in association with a return filing for tax year 2020. So in other words, if you don't give them the added information, you fall into one of these special groups, they're going to give you the check, but they're not going to be able to pick up that extra $500 per eligible child, and therefore you want to give them that information if it's applicable soon, because if you don't, then you're only going to get the check. You'll still get a check, but it'll only be for the $1,200. You won't get the extra $500 per eligible child, and you'll have to actually file a tax return, which isn't something you normally do because you're not normally required to, and you're not going to be able to do that till a later time period. So you won't get that extra $500 until a later time, and it'll take more time to do so than the special filing tool, which isn't filing a tax return. It's just giving them the kind of information. It's not like a whole tax return, which is usually focused on the income. The main focus of this tool is just to give them the qualifying child information that they would need to process that extra $500. Back to the text. Other people who don't normally file, including those with low income or no income, should use the non-filer interpayment info tool, tool to give the IRS basic information so they can their payments as soon as possible. So there's a link to that tool here. Now again, this tool is not for people who have not filed 2018 and 2019 but are required to file. If they haven't filed, so this tool is for people that haven't filed 2018, 2019, and they don't need to file because they're below the income limitation, and most likely also do not get payments from things like the Social Security, SSDI, SSI veterans, because if you got payments from them, the IRS already has the basic information to process. These are people that don't get any of those benefits and aren't required to file, possibly because their income is below a certain level. So this tool is going to be different than actually filing a tax return. It's similar to filing a tax return, but the tax return is geared towards getting your income level. So if you're not required to file because your income level is below a certain amount, the IRS doesn't need to know your income level to process the economic impact payment because they know it's not going to hit the phase-out period. So they don't need that. But if you're so you can use this tool, which should be easier than filing a 2018 or 2019 tax return, which is a little more cumbersome to do because you're going to have to provide the income information, whereas this tool is simply focused mainly on, who are you? Are you a qualified person? What's your Social Security number so we can know who you are, kind of thing, and then the payment, how to process the payment. That's what this tool is focused on. Whereas the full tax return would of course need the income information included with it as well. Back to the text. Question. The IRS is regularly updating the economic impact payment. There's a link to that here. And the Get My Payment tool. There's a link to that here. Frequently asked questions page on irs.gov as more information becomes available. So this can be kind of confusing. It's a new thing. It's not something that happens every year. So they're constantly updating this economic impact payment frequently asked questions page. So if you have specific questions, you may want to go to that page and check them out. Back to the text. Taxpayers concerned about visiting a tax professional or community organization for help with their taxes should remember the payments will be available through the rest of 2020. So they should have, it's, if you're worried about the payments being exhausted in this program or the time limitation, they're saying here that they'll be available through 2020. Back to the text. The IRS encourages taxpayers to share this information with family and friends. Some people who normally don't file a tax return may not realize they're eligible for an economic impact payment.